In a world where military power often defines global influence, Japan stands out as a rare exception, a highly advanced, economically powerful nation that technically has no standing military. How did this happen? Why would a country surrounded by geopolitical tensions, with neighbors like China and North Korea, choose to forego a conventional army? The answer lies in a complex mix of history, war trauma, constitutional law, and evolving international alliances. To understand Japan's pacifist stance, we must go back to the ashes of World War II, where a once militaristic empire was reshaped into a peaceful democratic state by forces far beyond its own borders. Japan is one of the world's largest economies, a technological powerhouse, and a key player on the global stage. Yet it has no traditional military in the conventional sense. This often confuses outsiders, who assume that every major nation has an army, navy, and air force. But Japan's situation is unique, shaped by a traumatic war, a powerful constitution, and a national philosophy that favors peace over aggression. Let's dive into the full story, the shadow of World War II. To understand Japan's current stance on military force, we must go back to its role in World War II. Before and during the war, Japan was a militaristic empire. It had invaded China, colonized Korea, and attacked numerous countries in the Pacific. The country's military leaders pursued an aggressive expansionist policy that led to catastrophic consequences. Japan's defeat in 1945 marked not just the end of the war, but also the collapse of its imperial military state. After the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and with much of the country reduced to ruins, the Japanese public grew deeply wary of war. The devastation forced the nation to reimagine its identity, not as a military empire, but as a peace-seeking democracy. The birth of Article 9, Japan's pacifist constitution. One of the most critical turning points came in 1947, when Japan adopted a new constitution, largely drafted under the guidance of the U.S. occupation forces led by General Douglas MacArthur. The most famous and controversial part of this constitution is Article 9, which states, "Aspiring sincerely to an international peace." The Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation, and the threat or use of force as a means of settling international disputes. It goes on to say, land, sea, and air forces, as well as other war potential, will never be maintained. This legal clause was revolutionary. Japan became the first modern state to constitutionally renounce the right to wage war or even to maintain a military. In essence, Article 9 outlawed offensive military capabilities and cast Japan as a permanently peaceful nation. While other countries maintained armies for deterrence, Japan made peace its defining principle. So, does Japan have no military? Here's where it gets complex. Technically, Japan does not have a military, at least not in the traditional offensive sense. However, it does have the Japan Self-Defense Forces, JSDF, which were established in 1954, just a few years after the Constitution was enacted. The JSDF consists of ground forces, a maritime branch, and an air wing. But here's the catch. The JSDF is not legally recognized as a military. Instead, it's designated for self-defense only. The official reasoning is that, while Japan renounces war, it still has the right to protect itself if attacked. The forces are heavily regulated, with strict limits on what weapons can be used, how much can be spent, and what international roles they can play. So while Japan may not have an army in name, it does have one in function, but only for defense. What can the JSDF do? The JSDF operates under tight constraints. It cannot engage in combat abroad unless it's in self-defense or support of international peacekeeping. It cannot launch preemptive strikes, even if a threat is imminent. Its weapons and technology are strictly defensive. No nuclear weapons, no long-range ballistic missiles, and limited offensive capabilities. All deployments require government and sometimes parliamentary approval, ensuring that military action is never taken lightly. That said, Japan's self-defense forces are technologically advanced and extremely well-trained. Japan has one of the largest defense budgets in the world, but it spends it differently, focusing on missile defense systems, cyber defense, and maritime patrols rather than tanks, aircraft carriers, or fighter jets for foreign invasion. Why doesn't Japan just amend Article 9? Changing Article 9 is no easy task. Although there have been multiple efforts, mostly from conservative leaders like former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, the Japanese public remains largely opposed to rearming the country. The trauma of World War II, combined with a culture that values peace and diplomacy, has made many citizens wary of militarization. Moreover, constitutional amendments in Japan require a two-thirds majority in both houses of parliament and a national referendum, a steep political hill to climb. So far, all attempts to revise Article 9 have either failed or been watered down into reinterpretations rather than full changes. U.S. military presence in Japan. Interestingly, Japan's lack of a traditional military doesn't mean it's defenseless. In fact, the United States maintains more than 50,000 troops across Japan under the U.S.-Japan Security Alliance signed in 1951. This allows Japan to benefit from American military protection, including access to U.S. naval fleets, air power, and missile defense. In return, Japan provides key bases in Okinawa and other regions, which are strategically vital for the U.S. in the Asia-Pacific. Some critics say Japan essentially outsourced its military to America, relying on U.S. troops for external threats while keeping its forces limited. Rising threats and shifting attitudes. Recent geopolitical tensions, especially from North Korea's missile tests, China's territorial claims, and Russia's increased military presence in East Asia, have reignited the debate over Japan's defense posture. Many in Japan, especially younger politicians and conservatives, argue that the country should rearm or at least reinterpret Article 9 more aggressively. In fact, in 2015, Japan passed controversial legislation allowing the JSDF to participate in collective self-defense, meaning they could assist allies under attack even if Japan itself was not directly threatened. While Japan still hasn't fully redefined its military status, the boundaries are slowly shifting, and the debate is far from over. The unusual balance of peace and power. Japan's case is one of the most fascinating examples of post-war reinvention. From a feared imperial power to a peaceful democracy with no formal military, Japan has built a modern identity rooted in restraint, diplomacy, and economic strength rather than aggression. Yet it hasn't ignored the realities of modern warfare. Through its JSDF, international alliances, and high-tech defensive systems, Japan walks a fine line between pacifism and preparedness. It's a country with no army, but one of the most secure nations on Earth. Conclusion: a global model or a ticking dilemma? Japan's pacifist approach has earned global respect. Many see it as a model of how nations can thrive without constant military aggression. Others, however, see it as unrealistic in a world full of threats. Will Japan stick to its peaceful roots forever? Or will changing times force it to redefine its place in the world order? One thing's certain: Japan's choice to disarm after World War II wasn't just about weapons, it was about transforming national identity. And in many ways, that legacy still defines Japan today. Like learning something new? Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more fascinating cross-cultural deep dives.